What if your mind has been lying to you? Not occasionally, not in dramatic, obvious ways that you could catch and correct, but systematically, reliably, in the same direction every single time, toward the worst version of whatever is in front of you. And what if that lying is so consistent, so automatic, so woven into the ordinary texture of how you experience your own life, that you stopped questioning it completely? You stopped asking whether the worst-case scenario your mind jumped to was accurate. You just accepted it. You built your days around it. You made decisions from inside it. You suffered through it. And then sometimes the thing happened and it was nothing like what you imagined, and you felt the relief but you didn't update. The next uncertain thing arrived and the mind went straight back to the worst version and you followed it there again without questioning it once. There is a specific reason your mind does this. A precise, biological, completely understandable reason that has nothing to do with pessimism, nothing to do with weakness, nothing to do with something being fundamentally wrong with the way you're wired. And knowing that reason is the thing that finally gives you leverage over it. Because you cannot argue with a tendency you don't understand, but a tendency you understand precisely, that you can interrupt. Every time. Starting now. The reason is called negativity bias. And before you decide that's a term you've already heard and move on, stay with me. Because most people who know the phrase have never fully understood what it actually means for the specific daily experience of living inside a mind that always goes to worst case. Negativity bias is not a tendency to be negative. It is a structural feature of how the brain allocates attention and weight to different kinds of information. Negative information, threats, losses, failures, rejections, dangers, is processed more deeply, retained more strongly, and weighted more heavily in decision-making than positive information of equal or even greater magnitude. This is not random. It is the result of millions of years of evolutionary pressure, in which the asymmetry between the cost of underestimating a threat and the cost of overestimating one was enormous. Miss a real danger and you die. Dread a danger that doesn't materialize and you lose some comfort. The math was clear and the brain built the bias in deep. But the bias was calibrated for a world of physical threats, of predators and scarcity and tribal conflict where the worst-case scenario was often the accurate one and preparing for it was survival. Your brain inherited that calibration and is now applying it to a world where most of the worst-case scenarios it generates are social, relational, professional, situations where the catastrophic outcome it is predicting is almost never the one that actually arrives. The brain is using ancient threat detection software on a modern environment and generating false positives at an enormous rate. And you have been living inside those false positives, suffering through them, making decisions from within them, without ever being told that the instrument generating them was built for a different world. Here is what this looks like in the specific texture of your actual days, because I want you to recognize it not as a concept but as something that is happening to you right now in identifiable ways. Your brain receives an ambiguous signal, a silence that could mean many things, an uncertain outcome that hasn't resolved yet, a physical sensation that could have multiple explanations, a social interaction that had a texture you couldn't quite read, and before you have consciously engaged with it, the worst-case interpretation is already present. Already feeling real. Already generating the physiological response that a real threat would generate. And everything after that, all the thinking, all the analysis, all the trying to figure out what's actually happening, is happening from inside the worst case. You are not assessing the situation neutrally and arriving at the worst-case conclusion. You are starting from the worst case and looking for evidence that would allow you to leave it. That reversal matters enormously. Because when you start from the worst case, the evidence you find tends to be the evidence that confirms it. A brain already running a threat response has its attention narrowed toward threat-relevant information. It finds what it's looking for. The neutral information that would challenge the worst-case interpretation is there, but it is weighted less, noticed less, remembered less. And so the worst case feels increasingly supported by evidence when what has actually happened is that the evidence-gathering process was contaminated by the starting position. You are not seeing the worst case because reality keeps producing it. You are seeing the worst case because your brain goes there first and then constructs the evidence that keeps you there. Here is the intervention. right now, because the understanding needs somewhere to land. The intervention is not positive thinking. I want to be direct about that because positive thinking as a response to negativity bias fails for a precise reason. It asks you to replace an automatic, subcortical, physiologically activated response with a deliberate cortical one. To override the threat response with the decision to see things differently. And that doesn't work because the threat response is faster than the decision. By the time you are trying to think more positively, the negative interpretation is already running in your body. Already generating cortisol. Already narrowing your attention. You cannot think your way upstream of a process that completed before you were aware it had started. What works is not replacing the worst case with the best case. It is inserting a question between the worst case and the moment you treat it as fact. One specific question, asked not to produce an answer but to create a pause in the automatic process. The question is, what is the most boring explanation for this? Not the best explanation. The most boring one. The version where nothing significant is happening. The version that requires no drama, no emergency preparation, no emotional mobilization. The most ordinary, unremarkable, uninteresting interpretation of exactly what's in front of you. The silence after your message is because they're busy. The physical sensation is because you're slightly dehydrated. The tone in the conversation was slightly off because they had a difficult morning that had nothing to do with you. The uncertain outcome is uncertain because outcomes are uncertain, not because it is specifically trending toward the worst version. The boring explanation. Every time. Not because it is always correct. Because it is almost always more accurate than the catastrophic one. And inserting it into the space between the worst case and your emotional response gives you a moment, a brief, real, usable moment, where you can assess which interpretation is actually supported by the available evidence rather than just which one your brain went to first. There is something about the relationship between worst-case thinking and the body that needs to be named because the experience of living in the worst-case scenario is not just a mental experience. It is a full physiological one. And the body's involvement is what makes the worst case feel so real even when it isn't. When your brain generates a worst-case interpretation, the amygdala fires. The stress response activates. Cortisol and adrenaline release in amounts calibrated to the severity of the perceived threat. The muscles contract slightly. The breathing shallows. The attention narrows. And all of that happens in response to something that does not exist. A scenario. An imagination. A possibility that the brain treated as present reality. And here's the cruel part. Once the body is in that physiological state, the brain interprets the body's state as evidence. The racing heart, the tight chest, the shallow breath, these are the same physical sensations that accompany real danger. And the brain, noticing them, concludes that something genuinely dangerous must be present. Because why else would the body be responding this way? The physiological response generated by the imagined worst case becomes evidence for the reality of the worst case. The brain convinces the body, and then the body convinces the brain, and the loop becomes self-confirming. This is why talking yourself out of the worst-case feeling is so difficult. The feeling has physical evidence. Your own body is testifying that the danger is real. And the body is not wrong about what it's feeling. It is just wrong about what caused the feeling. The feeling was caused by a thought, not a reality. But by the time the feeling is running, that distinction has been lost. The exhale interrupts this loop at the body level. Long, slow, complete. It sends the signal through the vagal nerve that contradicts the threat response. It tells the physiological system that the evidence in the body is not evidence of external danger, but of an internal response that can now begin to settle. And as the body settles, the worst case loses one of its most powerful sources of confirmation. The feeling that made it real begins to soften. And in that softening, the boring explanation becomes more accessible, more credible, more possible to hold alongside the catastrophic one without the catastrophic one immediately winning. There's something I want to say about what the worst-case thinking costs you specifically in the domain where it is least visible but most damaging. It costs you the present. Every moment spent inside a worst-case scenario that hasn't happened is a moment removed from the actual situation in front of you. The actual conversation, the actual relationship, the actual experience of whatever is happening right now. These are being processed by a brain that is partially elsewhere, inside a version of events that exists only in the simulation. And the actual situation, happening in real time, receives a fraction of your presence. A fraction of your attention. A fraction of your capacity for genuine engagement. And the actual situation, receiving that fraction, often produces the thing you were afraid of. Not because the worst case was accurate. Because a person half present in a conversation, bracing against an anticipated rejection, projects something that the other person feels without understanding. A person making a decision while catastrophizing about the outcome makes a different decision than they would from clarity. The worst-case thinking changes your behavior in ways that sometimes create the conditions for the outcome it was predicting. Not always, but enough that the brain logs it as confirmation. And the bias deepens. The present moment is the only place where the actual version of your life is happening. Not the anticipated version. Not the worst-case version. The actual one. And it deserves more of you than the catastrophizing has been leaving available. Here is the last thing I want to leave you with, and it's the most important one. Your mind has been lying to you in a specific direction for a long time. And the lie has felt like reality because it was delivered in the language of feeling. Because it came with physiological weight. Because the worst case has arrived enough times in your life that the pattern recognition system had real material to build from. And because nobody ever told you clearly that the instrument generating the worst case was calibrated for a different world and has been systematically overstating the danger in yours. But here is the truth that the bias has been obscuring. Go back through the actual history of your worst-case scenarios. Not the feeling of them. The outcomes. How many times did the thing you were absolutely certain was going to go catastrophically wrong exactly as you imagined? How many times did the silence mean what you were sure it meant? How many times did the uncertain outcome resolve into the version your nervous system was preparing you for? Almost never. Almost never in the exact way the worst case predicted. And yet the worst case kept arriving with the same certainty every time. The same physical weight. The same feeling of this time it's real. And you kept suffering through it. And the suffering was real even when the scenario wasn't. Your mind has been lying to you. Systematically. In the same direction. With the full physiological authority of a body that didn't know the difference between the simulation and reality. The boring explanation is almost always closer to the truth. The pause between the worst case and treating it as fact is where your actual life is. The exhale is what returns you to a body that can assess rather than a body that's already braced for impact. You have never needed to live in the worst-case scenario. The worst case has needed you to live in it, to give it the resources to keep running. Stop paying. The present is real. The worst case almost never is.